Good afternoon. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Filateti Center, and we wish to thank the New York State Council on the Arts and the Department of Cultural Affairs for providing the funding for this particular New York State Council for the Humanities and the Department of Cultural Affairs for providing the support which has made this panel possible. Now, the art exhibit you see on the wall was curated by Hallie Cohn with the assistance of Adam Ludwig, and it's entitled Portraiture, Old Masters and New. And David Pettibone, Philip Perlstein, you'll see represented here, Phyllis Herfield, Jenny Dubrow, and Matthew Miller are the painters in this show. And it illustrates, it's probably the last time this show will be up, the profound effect that Perlstein had on the kind of regeneration and rebirth of figuration in America. And all the other artists you see here derive from that initial revolutionary impetus that Chuck Close obviously followed through with. But at the time, it was an extremely, in the heart of the abstract expressionist and aftermath, it was an extremely bold move. So that's what this show is about. All Filateti's events are simulcast and can be viewed by going to our site at the time of the event, or they are archives. You go to www.filatetis.org and you can see them there in about 3 days, or on YouTube. Now, was anyone here for Olivier's 1948 Hamlet last night? Nobody. So it's a wonderful film. I commend it to you, and we had a great discussion afterwards with Simon Critchley and Jameson Webster. One of the lines you may recall in Hamlet is "The rest is silence," and regrettably, Filateti's will be closing, and this is perhaps its final event, or one of the final events we're going to have ever. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you, and let's enjoy the event and enjoy all the archive of wonderful events and activities that we've done here at Filateti's. I'm now pleased to present Heather Dubrow. Heather Dubrow. Heather Dubrow is John D. Boyd. I always get this. I have trouble with this. John D. Boyd, S.J. Yes. Chair in the Poetic Imagination at Fordham University and director of the Poets Out Loud reading series. She is the author of 6 scholarly books, most recently The Challenges of Orpheus, Lyric Poetry in Early Modern England, and the poetry collection Forms and Hollows, which is available. Afterwards, you can buy it, along with other books by our distinguished panelists. Other publications include a co-edited collection of essays, 2 chapbooks of poetry, and articles on early modern literature and on teaching, as well as poems in numerous journals. Current projects include a book on the academic profession. This is really interesting to me. What's that going to be? What's the
Well, I'm
thrust?
interested in rethinking the idea that lyric is located in the here and now. What happens if you say, maybe it's not that immediate after all. Maybe it has, as it were, echoes that I hope the sound people can pick up and change a little bit. So I'm looking at things like pointing words, like this, concepts of the future also.
Right.
Is there anything we can do about the sound, do you think?
Are we having problems?
You want it to be higher?
No, my sense is that I'm echoing.
You're not.
I'm not, okay.
No.
Okay, that's fine then. Let's not worry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that phenomenon is not known as echolalia, by the way. And a revisionist study, by the way. She's doing a revisionist study of immediacy in lyric poetry, focusing especially on spatiality and temporality. Okay, that's the same book, but I didn't finish the sentence. So, Heather, I give it to you, and you'll introduce our other panelists.
Thank you. Before I do that, though, I want to express everybody's appreciation to Polly Rosenwake, the Philoctetes staff person who's the primary organizer of these poetry events. But I also want to start by inviting all of you to think about the term, or is it terms in the plural, poet-critic? Do the 2 roles embrace each other? Do they walk on parallel paths, exchanging polite words? Do they avoid each other's eyes, the way we New Yorkers are taught to do when we see people in the street? Or do they even turn against each other, heavily armed with their pride and prejudices? To put it another way, are poet and critic joined by a hyphen that can be a bridge, or are they separated by the kind of landmines that so often separate discussions in the poetry wars? The people on this panel will explore questions like that from a range of perspectives. For example, we'll talk about the special challenges somebody faces in reviewing poetry, particularly if she or he is a poet themselves. We'll also discuss institutional issues with a lot of repercussions outside the university. For example, the effects on a career of publishing both poetry and critical work, the appropriate professional degree for a poet, and how do the various perspectives of poets and critics contribute to key issues about poetry relevant outside the academy as well as within it, such as the sort of audience to which it's addressed, the extent to which clarity should be a central goal. Our agenda in talking about all of this, I'll introduce our panelists one by one. Each will briefly raise some questions and issues about the topic. In general, here and when we read poetry, we'll move alphabetically, though I'll introduce issues at the end because I figure that you will have heard enough of my voice in the first 5 or 10 minutes. Then at the end, the poets will read selections from our books, which, as we just heard, are on sale outside as well. So, first introduction. Stephen Burt, a professor of English at Harvard, is the author of 2 books of poetry and several works of criticism, most recently the essay collection Close Calls with Nonsense, Reading New Poetry, which is ranked as a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And hold on to your hats, berets and otherwise. He's published over 150 essays, articles, and reviews since 1994. In Close Calls with Nonsense, Stephen Burt approvingly quotes Frank O'Hara's insistence that, as Burt put it, fun and wisdom were both worth seeking in art. As you'll see when he reads his own poems, that fun is apparent in the playfulness, the wit, the sound effects of his writing. This is a poet who crafts titles like Essay on Mass Transit Subsidies. But the wisdom in question is evident not only in the poems, but also very much in the criticism, which is characterized by the principles he himself wittily articulates when comparing poetry criticism to, are you still holding on to those hats, I hope? Runway, the show about fashion. That is, focusing on the poet's works, not their lives, and being trenchant and acute, but also generous and fair-minded. Steve.
Yeah, thank you to Heather for organizing this. Thanks to the other panelists. Thanks for coming here, and thanks to Philoctetes, the center itself. I feel I'm cutting in and out on the microphone. Is that?
No, you're not.
I'm not.
Okay.
I am? I'm not. I brought 3 quotes from other writers and then some questions. And I'm going to keep asking you questions until I run out of time, and they will circulate if I've asked the right ones about the poet, the poet critic, and linger in the air. And the first is Socrates speaking in Plato's Ion, which some of you will know. And Socrates says to Ion, who is a rhapsode, a professional reciter of poetry, but if, as I believe, he asks, if, as I believe, you have no art, but speak all these beautiful words about Homer unconsciously under his inspiring influence, he recites Homer, then I acquit you of dishonesty and shall only say that you are inspired. Which do you prefer to be thought, dishonest or inspired? And then the second comes from the polemical art critic and essayist Dave Hickey, who writes in an essay, writes that criticism, as such, is the written equivalent of air guitar, flurries of silent, sympathetic gestures with nothing at their heart but the memory of the music. And then the third comes from the poet critic, as we would now say, Ben Jonson, whose famous couplet reads, "Pray thee take care that takes my book in hand to read it well, that is, to understand." And Jonson was concerned, as we're all concerned, I think, not just with how people read our own poetry and whether they get it right, but with whether readers get other poems right. And if you are a poet critic, I suppose, as I keep being told I am, you think about the relationship between helping other people get other poems by other people right and the relationship you want your readers to have to your own poems. So here are some questions. Has has the critic, as in Plato's Ion, always been the apparent enemy of the poet? Has the critic always been the demystifier, the explainer who comes in from the outside? Has the critic always been, instead, as in Ben Jonson and in Horace, who Jonson modeled himself on, a poet wearing a different hat, or with the same hat turned around, letting himself and others into a workshop where we simply see how the poems get made? If poets are primarily makers of objects, constructors of things, then are poets and critics unproblematically likely to be the same people who know and can therefore show other people how these fascinating things get made? If poets are primarily seers or prophets taking dictation, as Jack Spicer said, from Martian radio or from Martians on the radio or from the gods or from the unconscious, then must poets and critics be different people or the same person in incompatible roles, like the Sibyl when she's being a Sibyl inhaling the burning fumes, or the Sibyl when she's out of the cave doing something else. If we are anxious about poet critics, if we consider the poet critic a problematic or a contradictory beast like the manticore or the push-me-pull-you, or the superhero with a secret identity that she must protect, is that because we are anxious about the incompatibility of those two ancient descriptions of poets, the seer, the inspired one, and the maker of things? Is criticism an attempt to say something that is true about poetry or about a poem that is then unchanged after the criticism happens? Or is criticism an attempt to do something to or with poetry so that the poem isn't quite the same afterwards? Is criticism ever as autotelic or as autonomous as we often take poetry to be, so that a critic is addressing a problem that she wants to solve for her own, for herself, for her own sake, in order to just have the critical work get done? Or is criticism, unlike poetry, a profoundly heteronymous applied art that is overtly responsive to not only an existing thing, but an existing audience with expectations and beliefs? Is poetry, which after all does seem to get altered by its era, by changing times, even someone like Emily Dickinson, who we often think of as locked up somewhere responding to her own mind, we now know was watching the Civil War happen and responding to it, is poetry as heteronymous, as influenced by the expectations of an existing audience and an existing era as we already tend to believe criticism is? Auden, who thought that writing negative reviews was bad for the character, made part of his living for a long time by writing book reviews and other things we'd call criticism, but they were almost never about living poets. They were mostly about works of theology and history and belles lettres. Why did Auden do that? T.S. Eliot at one point called his own critical work the byproduct of his private poetry workshop, and speculated self-deprecatingly that all serious poets who write about poetry were also just giving you the byproducts of their own private poetry workshop. Did he mean it? Should we take that seriously? Was he right? Can we ever prove him wrong? Do poets who write a lot of criticism alter their attitudes toward poetry by doing so? Do such poets lower the standard unconsciously for their own work, or change those standards by thinking, for example, too often about what an existing audience expects? Or is that a good thing? Didn't some other poets, some major poets, Pope, for example, seem really to change what he did in ways that were interesting and productive? By looking at what his audience wanted. Can a poet gain as much as he loses by remaining overtly conscious, as practicing critics have to be conscious, of an audience's expectations and of the temper of the times? Is it fair to demand that poets take account of the state of their art in general, of the temper of the times? I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Steve. Bonnie Costello is professor of literature at Boston University. She's the author of many books on modern and contemporary poetry, including most recently Shifting Ground, Reinventing Land.
Tables.
Excuse me.
Planets on Tables.
Planets on Tables is the more recent.
Okay. I was listing both of them, actually.
Okay.
Let me try again. Including most recently Planets on Tables, Poetry, Still Life in the Turning World, and Shifting Ground, Reinventing Landscape in Modern American Poetry. She's also general editor of the Selected Letters of Marianne Moore. Her gifts, and I'm not using the word lightly, as a critic, have been recognized by a whole series of awards. To name just a few, a Guggenheim Fellowship, her appointment as a Coleman Fellow at the New York Public Library for next year, and, above all, her election to one of the most prestigious professional bodies in the country, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Like many others, I particularly respect Bonnie Costello's pursuit of precise, nuanced distinctions, which often results in her challenging concepts of lyric that have been unthinkingly accepted by almost everybody else. For example, her current work on the first-person plural, that is, the use of we rather than I, calls into question widespread assumptions about lyric subjectivity, the lyric speaker. She's also a splendid close reader of texts. Witness, among so many other examples, her interpretation of Marianne Moore's Moose, which is by far the best analysis of that iconic poem I've ever encountered. Bonnie.
Thank you. Thank you for including me. I feel as though I'm a bit of an intruder in this group in the sense that I played around enough with writing poetry to have a deep respect for the challenges involved, but I'm not an active poet. I don't present myself as a poet. I'm a literary critic and lover of poetry. And one of the things that I wanted to introduce is a sense of the range of activities that we call criticism. As someone who works in an English department but also reviews contemporary poetry, I'm very aware of different audiences and different kinds of activities that are underneath this category called criticism. To say something about my own motivations for reviewing first, they come from an excitement to know more about what's being written in my own time. Which is something that is not required of me, particularly as a literary academic, but just as a person living in my own time. I want to know the literature of my own time. And reviewing is one of the ways I make time to get to know a writer's work really intimately. That's the payoff for me, and to spend long enough to be able to sort of really discover a poet is very exciting to me. So there's a kind of a heaven in that. Sometimes publishers will push me into a polemics about it, and I'm willing to go there on occasion, but the polemics are not usually the motivation. The motivation is just the wish to know more deeply. And it's an evaluative impulse as well as an exploratory one, of course. Reviewing is one of the places where evaluative criticism is more alive than anywhere else, and probably is underappreciated, I think, in the study of literature, the need to make discriminations and to say my taste goes here or not. I thought, though, that I would so there's reviewing, there's literary criticism in the sense of a form that offers a better knowledge of individual texts, they're formal and as a formal and expressive objects. And then there's what we call literary theory, which has a greater generalizing force that looks at the nature of text and the nature of text as interventions into culture and so on in the broadest sense. And all those are activities we put under the rubric of criticism. What I wanted to think about, and I hope that others will be interested in, is the relationship of all of these different kinds of criticism to, but particularly to, I suppose, theory, the relationship of poetry as a theory engaged activity and literary criticism as a theory engaged activity. That is, it seems to me that poetry is always or often the best poetry, most original poetry of our time is always creating new ideas about what the role of the imagination is, what kinds of interventions it can have in our experience. But it's a kind of intuitive and intuitive engagement with ideas, full of flashes and insights that are then, I think, taken up in criticism in a more logical and a rational way. So there's this sense that poetry is always in advance of the more rational activity of criticism. To me, the most some of the most exciting discoveries of our culture are made first by the arts, and then the more rational structures pursue them and uncover them in other ways. What worries me is when the relationship is altered, and there is a kind of poetry that sometimes gets written which is seems prescribed by criticism rather than up ahead of where criticism wants to go, where certain ideas that are circulating, especially in academic settings and settings where criticism is dominant, those ideas then become formulas for poets. This happens, I think, in part because of the increasing academization of the poetry world. Poets tend to have jobs in English departments and to function in university environments more and more. And so it seems to me that's the wrong order of relationship. And so that's something that I'm very interested in, the cognitive differences between creative writing, the kind of first of all, risk-taking, leaping ahead orientation of creative, imaginative works, and the kind of more analytical work, not that it doesn't take risks of its own, but the more kind of analytical work that criticism is. There are different ways of thinking that I think need each other, but that are distinct. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Described by the very distinguished critic and poet John Hollander as, quote, one of the best poets of her generation, Rachel Hadas is currently Board of Governors professor at Rutgers, and she's also taught at Columbia and Princeton. Hadas has published 11 books of poetry, as well as translations, edited collections, and numerous critical essays. The Ache of Appetite is her newest volume of poetry, and Strange Relation, a memoir of marriage, dementia, and poetry, is her latest prose work. Very active in several professional organizations, Hadas was vice president of the Poetry Society of America. Her commitment to outreach work includes her associations with AIDS patients, which also issued in an edited collection from a workshop. To winnow a few from her many honors, her work has garnered the O.B. Hardison Jr. Poetry Prize, the Ingram Merrill Foundation Award in Poetry, the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters Literature Award. She's held a Guggenheim Fellowship. Both her poetry and her critical writing are characterized by the elegance and spareness of the classical art and literature that has so deeply influenced her work, as well as by a penetrating intensity. For example, speaking of our brief combining poetry and criticism, witness how one of her many poems on her husband's illness plays on the critical term monodrama. Quote, everyone married to a person walled into silence. Mine the drama, his the mono, as he sealed in brick by brick. Rachel.
Thank you, Heather. It's great to be here at this sort of elegiac Philoctetes occasion. I'm sorry to hear that we're closing, and I'm actually going to be, I hope, lyrically brief here. I mean, I'm very inspired by Steve's wonderful transhistorical questions floating in the air, and by Bonnie's wonderfully scrupulous and articulate way of trying to define terms. So I'd like to sort of piggyback on that a little bit. I think it's extremely important to not only to distinguish between reviewing and criticism and theory, which Bonnie has done beautifully, and to talk about some of the motivations, as she said, of exploring and evaluating. I could not agree more that evaluating is sort of underperformed in our culture. And the way Bonnie is saying that poetry's always out ahead of theory, but I also, or criticism or reviewing, but another way to look at it is that this enormous amount of cultural production is going on, literary production, and part of the function of what the critic or reviewer or theorist writes is somehow to mediate it, assimilate it, absorb it. I was coming out of the Alexander McQueen show at the Met yesterday, and a man buttonholed me. Men rarely buttonhole me. I'm too old, but he was so angry. He wanted to engage me in conversation about how McQueen was kind of the end of Western civilization. And I didn't agree with him at all, but I was too tired to argue with him. And I think he would have attacked me physically anyway. You know, and he said, Picasso, Brian, then you've got this. But, you know, I think it made me go home and reread Judith Thurman's piece in The New Yorker about McQueen, because there was an articulate, well-argued setting forth of some of my own ideas. That's one of the things criticism can do for us. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about other problematic, underdefined terms that are floating around in the culture. And my fellow panelists have already seen my plaintive paragraph on this subject. It's extremely parochial compared to Steve's wonderful Platonic throwing up of questions, but it may prove to be not unrelated. It seems to me that the state of the poetry world has been, in my memory, 40 or 50 years, small but fraught and ill-tempered. And yet, is it even so small now in the age of cyberspace? It's hard to know. It's larger, but still ill-tempered and sort of fissured. There are fraught alliances and oppositions playing out on a scale that used to be called claustrophobic. You know, the stakes are extremely low. That's why people get so angry. And yet, maybe the scale, instead of being claustrophobic, is very large. It's hard to tell. So to be very specific about the kind of work we're talking about as working critics, I am not a distinguished literary critic like either Bonnie or Stephen. I'm sort of a working belles-lettrist who has written some reviews. Maybe that's being too modest, but not much too modest. So reviews and blurbs, for example, which are what I'm often called upon to write or think about writing, not only what you write, but whether you write them at all, are decisions clouded, unfortunately, by considerations that are not purely aesthetic, but that could be called political. And we all know that the language, say, of blurbs is inflated past the point of decency. Under the circumstances, an easy choice, and a choice that I've often made recently because I'm busy with so many other things anyway, is to not review and to not blurb. And people often... It's not that everyone's banging at my door saying, write a review, that would be nice. It's not the case. But one can discriminate and say, you know, no, I think I won't do that. An older poet, a woman poet I won't name, decided years ago, for example, she will blurb only first books of poetry only by women poets. That's how she's arrived at a sort of a politically okay solution for her and for her level of energy. So I often am not sure what to do. If you teach poetry, as I and many people do, I think we all do here, do you particularly support your students? Of course you do, but what if you think their work isn't really all that good? There are many, many, many dilemmas at many levels. So can other people, panelists and other people in the room, help me to navigate these waters? You know, what do you do and what ought one to do? There's not much guidance. As my sister is fond of saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Complicating matters are, again, going back at least a generation, the hoary, gray-headed poetry wars and the dreary dichotomies of the naked and clothed poetry or the raw and cooked poetry or the white-faced and red-faced, red-skinned and pale-faced poetry. You all know the dichotomy, and sometimes anthologies now claim we have moved past these dichotomies, and other critics say absolutely not, as witness the anthology that has erroneously claimed we've moved past these dichotomies. A final spritz of confusion, and I'm adding too many metaphors on purpose, is the blank check nature of a term like form. We were batting this around a little bit at lunch, but I could extend that. What the hell is meant by form? What indeed is meant by poetry at all? And one of the functions of criticism at the most basic level is often to say, well, you may say, my 5-year-old could paint better than that, or I don't call that a poem, do you? And part of the critic's job is to say, calm down, and let's look at this a little more peacefully. My husband, who was a composer, was, as soon as he told people at parties he was a composer, they would start screaming at him, why is 20th century music so ugly? And it sort of forced him into writing essays of cultural criticism. So that might be another motivation to justify what we do and to clarify what we do. I would be very grateful for definitions of poetry and form, for starters. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Eric McHenry is an assistant professor at Washburn College. He's the author of a book called Pot Scrubber Lullabies. Isn't that a fantastic title?
The second book, Post Scrubber Lullabies.
Okay, that's postmodern, post-scrubber, okay, which won the Kate Tufts Discovery Award and was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award. I'm particularly impressed by the elaborate and subtly patterned rhyme schemes in his work and by the shifts in tone in his poetry. From the low-key everyday, it's the largest Walmart in the Plain States, to images like graffiti climbing over walls like ivy, to the dramatic impact of his final lines, there's only mud and metaphor. Another book, from which he'll read at the end of our session, is coming out this fall from Waywiser Press, Mommy, Daddy, Evan Sage. As that suggests, it's a volume of children's poems with woodcuts by Nicholas Garland. Also a translator and reviewer, he frequently writes on contemporary poetry for the New York Times Book Review magazine. Again winnowing from a long list of impressive awards, I'll mention that he's been nominated no fewer than 6 times for Pushcart Prize and has also won the Theodore Retke Prize, an Academy of American Poets Prize, and the Robert Fitzgerald Translation Prize.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And I, too, am sorry to hear that this may be the swan song for the Philoctetes Center. I'd like it entered into the record that I was responsible for closing this place down. I too feel a little bit like an intruder in this eminent panel here. For reasons that I fear will become clear as I start talking, but I am delighted to be here. My last name begins with M, and so I'm not used to coming at the end of the alphabet, but I happen to on this panel, and so I took care to put together some prefatory remarks that are narrow and a little bit shallow and idiosyncratic to make sure that I wasn't going to be repeating anything that anybody else had said. So thanks for bearing with me on that as well. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the challenges of reviewing poetry for periodicals and maybe particularly for newspapers, since that's the corner of criticism with which I'm most familiar. There's an old adage I read recently in the legal profession that justice is what the judge ate for breakfast. And it was recently proven, more or less, by researchers at Columbia University who found that a prisoner's odds of being granted parole stood at about 65% if he came before the judge first thing in the morning or immediately after a lunch break, but declined to near zero by the end of the session. And I worry that some poets may suffer the same fate. My wife once asked me what I thought of a book of poetry I was preparing to review, and I said, I can't drink enough coffee to make it interesting. And it occurred to me later that that may have had as much to do with the fact that I was going on 5 hours of sleep and that I'm a young striver who's trying to review books while balancing a 4/4 teaching load and family life, as it does with any failing on the poor poet's part. I think that opening a book of poetry at 9 p.m. immediately after wrestling 2 children into their pajamas and into bed is just profoundly unfair to the poet. You find yourself thinking things like, good Christ, would it kill you to use the English language, Wallace Stevens? A reviewer of contemporary poetry, particularly if he's working on a deadline, may be inclined to favor books that make the fewest demands on him or her, that yield their pleasures the most readily. That's an anxiety of mine as I set out to review books of poetry. Now, that's a risk that undoubtedly inheres in any sort of criticism. No one reviews in a vacuum. But because contemporary poetry is a literary form known for making demands on the reader, and because we are living in a time, I think, of unprecedented stylistic diversity in poetry with no sort of generally accepted criteria for excellence, I worry that what the judge had for breakfast may be becoming the most influential arbiter of poetic taste in America. And this fear is one of my least favorite things about being a poetry reviewer. Just to round out the list here, I've got a few more. Fear that an error will make me immortal. Fear that I'll somehow displease Alan Cordell. Unpublished manuscripts tied up with strings. These are my other least favorite things. Fear of a fact check from someone like Bonnie. Fear that I'm going to get cold-cocked at Swanee. Deadlines that fly by on owl-silent wings. These are my other least favorite things. All of these concerns, I should add, vaporize when I'm reviewing a book that I'm genuinely enthusiastic about, just to end on an affirming note here. Then the gushing good news spreader takes over. My favorite thing about poetry criticism is that it is one of the few places where advocacy and boosterism can be genuinely interesting to read. Hearing Christopher Ricks anatomize Philip Larkin's Love Songs and Age was a transformative experience for me as a poet. And rereading Randall Jarrell's essays is like rereading the poetry he praises. You're surprised every time. Thanks very much.
At Philoctetes, the chairs of panels participate in the same way the panelists do. So let me start my presentation with telling you a story that's an urban legend, the equivalent of all those alligators in our sewers. I was talking to the chair of a department at a university I won't name except to say it's not my current employer, Fordham. And the chair didn't realize that I was a poet as well as a literary critic. So he took me aside and said, well, setting salaries for poets is pretty easy. I never give them much money because what they write are so short, such short things, and they don't even rhyme. Well, I start with that to introduce the question of why are there so many tensions between people who identify entirely as critics and identify entirely as poets? A lot of people have been talking so far about wearing both hats. Let's talk about the complexities for a minute. And I want to pose a lot of questions about those complexities of wearing one or the other. Why are the two, quote, sides so often dismissive of each other? First, let's look at why critics at their worst make comments like that one about poets' salaries. 4 questions, I think. 1, how does different training affect it? We know that, though this is changing, many poets still get an MFA, and of course in the academy, the master's degree in literature is what Shakespeare called a tottered weed of small worth held. 2nd, different vocabulary, and we might want to think about how the vocabulary of the two differs. 3rd, how about different credentialing? A lot of the schools that give highly respected MFAs have names that are not brand names. Plus, think about the names of presses, and I don't think this is entirely an accident. My scholarly books come out from Johns Hopkins University Press, Cornell University Press. Poetry collection was recently published by Cherry Grove. And listen to some of the other names: White Pines, Black Sparrow, Snail Pace, and even one of the most distinguished publishers, who, among other things, has the great sense to publish Steve Burt's poetry, is called Grey Wolf. Maybe we should forgive some prejudices from people like that chair, because, frankly, those sound to me like the names of Indian chiefs in grade B movies. A 4th and possibly more complicated reason is what the two sides talk about. when they talk about the composition of text, since many critics today play down the role of the author. And my fifth question, fifth possible category, in what ways, if at all, is gendering relevant here? I wonder whether professors of literature sometimes transfer onto the relationship between poet and literature professor the dichotomy in which they feel trapped from the opposite perspective. That is, people talk about the hard sciences in ways that sometimes make literature professors implicitly described as effeminized, soft. So if this paradigm is reversed, you've got the tough-minded literary critic and the soft, effeminized poet. And I think that goes very deep throughout the culture. In fact, I know one poet who had a high school student say to him, "I didn't know poets could be big men like you." A new series of questions: what kinds of tensions complicate how poets see literary critics? Let me just raise one possibility so that we can talk more about others. Many poets still identify literary criticism with the high French theory of the 1990s. In the case of some poets, as my fellow panelists have suggested, that provides a model for better or worse. In the case of other poets, it provides a prejudice with the assumption that that type of theory is obscure in its style, uninformed in its approach to the creative process, and unsympathetic to the writer. In any event, whatever sources such prejudices come from, they snowball. If people don't listen to each other, if they don't talk to each other, they're all the more likely to feed the original misunderstandings that led to those divides. So, what are the solutions? How do we get our alligators out of the sewers? I want to leave that question mainly to our discussion, but I'll suggest that panels like this can help, as did a splendid one I went to at Columbia a week or two ago, organized by Michael Goldston and Molly Murray. I'm also interested in our doing something I know Bonnie does as well, in teaching courses, encouraging people who primarily identify as literary critics also to write something. In my sonnets course, they were all encouraged to write a sonnet, and if they found it impossible, at least a quatrain and a couplet. If poets read more literary criticism and more literature written by people besides the close friends of the person teaching the course, they're likely to know a lot more about how literature works and be far more in tune to its range. Plus, I think it's very helpful for us simply to be aware of these prejudices. And I ask you to think about other ways of negotiating them. On some campuses, creative writers and literary critics are housed in completely separate buildings. That may be necessary logistically, but why don't we, in the course of the discussion that the panel will have and that we all want to have with you, talk about how we can all be at least metaphorically in the same building? And to return to that unfortunate chair, whether or not poets rhyme, how, rather than greasing the stairs of our shared building, we can leave the doors to our offices open. So let me open doors for the panel. What would you like to follow up, particularly, from what we've been talking about?
I think we should take your third and your seventh question first.
Okay.
Maybe we should begin at the end. I don't know, talking about the separate housing that the two disciplines sometimes have and may implicitly require, although that may be an implication that we draw from it rather than something that was there at the outset. I wonder, at your respective institutions, is there that kind of physical separation, and to what extent does that contribute to any tensions that may exist?
Well, I'll start with that. I mean, I think I have a special, maybe an exceptional experience here. The undergraduate college I went to, there were, I would say that among the faculty in literature, those with PhDs were in the minority. This was Bennington College. Many creative writers were teaching literature courses. There were creative writing courses, but there were more literature classes, and so you could take a course in Milton with Alvin Feynman, or a course in Thomas Mann with Bernard Malamud. And I think that, and then this fluidity was much less so, but still there were open doors at Cornell University. As a PhD student, I was permitted to take creative writing courses toward my PhD, for instance, which is almost unheard of now. Though the poets there, A.R. Ammons, Robert Morgan, and others taught creative writing, there was a sense in which the faculty were friends with each other, that Ammons was great friends with Baxter Hathaway, and so on. So there was a kind of camaraderie that may have to do with living in Ithaca as much as anything, But there was and now at Boston University, where I teach, we have a very strong creative writing program. Fine arts, masters of fine arts in creative writing are required to take literature classes, so my graduate seminars are usually about 50-50. And so, though I would say I'm usually the only faculty member present at poetry readings, the only academic faculty member as opposed to creative writing, although I have to say the creative writing faculty don't show up for poetry readings much either. But so there isn't a communication, but in the classroom there is. And I find it a very fertile ground for young minds, young critics and young writers to try to understand each other and the kinds of questions that they ask. So that's a very exciting space, and I think the investment that the poets have in their craft isn't a narrow one. It may be that they want to talk about a comma, but it may also be that they want to talk about what does it mean to write about nature in after 9/11 or something like that. The urges of the culture and what it means to locate yourself as a poet in that culture. So I find that actually there's a lot of positive interaction going on. At least in my experience, it may be an unusual one. I'm certainly aware of the dichotomies and the indifferences, but my experience, maybe it's just me, that it's been more the other way.
Notice that we're talking about teaching. Not all poets teach. Not all poets who teach should teach, although some poets who don't teach probably should. Not all critics teach. Not all critics who teach should teach. Not all critics who teach like teaching, though some critics who don't teach should. I wonder whether there are psychological, emotional, or intellectual conflicts, incompatibilities between teaching others how to write better poetry, and on the one hand, and teaching others how to write better prose about other people's poetry. Mm-hmm. Conflicts that have to do with how we teach and that do not apply to and do not hinder the interplay between writing one's own criticism and writing one's own verse. And here's one example. When you are working with apprentice poets, young poets, a set of poets who are early career, if you want to be flattering about it, or just starting out, in order to be fair to them, you have to pretend that their work is better than it is. A lot. A lot frequently and a lot better than it is. You have to spend some time, and my experience is some energy, really finding things to praise or directions in which collocation of words whose sounds are not very interesting, whose the set of words that just aren't doing very much. You have to pretend that you see directions that could make those sets of words great. And if you're not able to do that kind of pretending at all, you probably shouldn't be teaching poetry workshops. But doing that kind of pretending is sort of, past a certain point, the opposite of what you should be doing when you are writing, in particular, reviews of books of poetry. If I've got a stack of 100 student poems in front of me and I'm teaching a poetry workshop, which I no longer do regularly, but I used to do, I have to pretend they could all become something really fascinating and memorable, at least while I'm writing on them in purple and green. If I have a stack of 100 new books of poetry out, and I have to decide whether to take the 1,000 words I've been given and write about 1 or 2 or 5, and I clearly can't write about 100, it is not useful to me to go through them all and imagine what they might become. I need to deal with what they are and figure out which one I think is most likely to be worth recommending to 200 or 2,000 people I'm never going to meet. So I want us to think about whether these apparent conflicts between being a poet and being a critic are really conflicts between teaching poetry workshops and being a critic.
I hear two questions coming out of what Bonnie and Steve just said. One, what are the differences between the roles and where do those differences lie? I mean, how much are they related to teaching? How much are they related to cognitive differences? And given that we are discussing differences, what can people learn from each other? What can a critic learn from talking closely to a poet, for example? What can somebody teaching a poetry workshop learn from somebody teaching a course on 17th century lyric?
I didn't exactly hear those questions. What I heard was that and I think Steve was extremely honest here about the requirements of pedagogy on the one hand, to sort of have what my father used to call a low boiling point, and the requirements of criticism or theory, but more criticism, which is to have a high boiling point, to be a gatekeeper, to discriminate. I'm not sure whether it has to do with cognition, which I'm not an expert on, but certainly sort of the cultural choreography of what is required. And the individual temperament. Steve is absolutely right. Not everyone should teach. And then how does that comport with writing one's own poems? You have to have a very low boiling point for student poems, but you don't want to have a low boiling point for your own poems. So it's a huge can of worms, which we cannot do justice to in the time here. We'd be here after the Philoctetes Center closed.
I think to an extent it's actually potentially useful to one's criticism to have to go through that process of looking closely at student work and sometimes really hunting around for that single thing that you can praise and that creates a standard to which you then try to hold the student and try to encourage the student to rise toward. Although the boiling points, as you suggest, are very different, and it requires a certain maybe cognitive dissonance to spend part of a day praising student poetry that's really still so inchoate, and then within the next hour, if you don't have to teach that period, talking about why the latest collection by poet X, who's published with Knopf, was disappointing to you. But both of those activities require really close attention to the text and just taking your time with it. And so I think both of them serve to remind you of how important it is to take your time with the text. So that may be one respect in which that the sort of affirming critical attention that student writing requires is beneficial to one's work as a discerning critic. Maybe. That may be a little Pollyanna-ish of me, but I would put that out there as well.
I want to throw in a remark about the we've talked about low boiling point and nurturing attitudes of criticism toward students, and the harsher, more judgmental, more dismissive, even irritable criticism I mean, there is a lot of irritability in analysis and in criticism, and even we murder to dissect and so on. But there's a nurturing element. Maybe nurturing isn't the right word, but there is a productive result sometimes for even those high boiling point, irritable kinds of behaviors in criticism. Not only because they weed out, for the general audience of poetry readers, what because nobody can read it all, we need to know what we should read, and that is one job of reviewing. But I think the example of Wallace Stevens in the 1930s is an example of the good work that negative criticism can do, because Wallace Stevens. I'm sure many of you know Wallace Stevens' poetry. He called himself a pure poet. He wrote very experimental, whimsical, playful poetry throughout the first decades of the 20th century. A kind of gaudiness at times, a kind of spareness at other times, but with a strong drive toward aestheticism, art for art's sake. Then the Depression happened. Unfortunately, the reissue of his first book, Harmonium, was 1931. Not a good time for a book of pure poetry to come out. And the reviews were very, very negative across the board. Except Marianne Moore, who liked it. But, she's an insider. It didn't count. So what does a poet like Stevens, who is going to go on to write, because he needs to write to live, it's the breathing for him, what does he do? He doesn't abandon pure poetry. He doesn't abandon aesthetics. He doesn't even abandon the orientation toward his art that he had from his formative years. But he changes it because the culture has spoken. And there is such a thing as an audience. And the poet needs to, as Stevens himself said, turn toward the town and think about it. And he remained and said very directly that I am a poet, a pure poet, and that the role of the poet is to speak to the imagination, even in times of great pressure. But there is a new openness to audience, a new sense of the wider culture that I think is, at least in part, a result of all this criticism he was getting at this historical moment. Very high boiling point criticism that was probably a little careless and, empty stomach attitude, certainly in the Depression. No breakfast at all. But it was productive in the end, I think, and it made Stevens a greater poet, not a lesser poet. So, as speaking from the point of view of someone who's mostly a critic, I often get comments from poets about, why do you write negative criticism? There's so little attention to poetry as it is. I don't write a great deal of negative criticism, but I do think it serves a purpose, and not just the purpose of vetting and disposing of dross, but in nurturing the art form further.
Bonnie's mentioning the culture having spoken crystallizes the fact that we've been generalizing during a lot of this discussion, but there also have been comments about culturally specific issues, what happens at a particular moment that can change how we write. For example, why don't I leave it up to the panel? What's happening now that you think complicates these issues, both things that you brought up in your presentation and others?
Well, the speed of the technology means that paying attention is almost impossible. It's not expected. It's very hard to do. And just on a more positive note, not to be all Jeremiads, I think one of the things poets and critics and teachers have in common, whether they're the same person or not, is we're standing on this melting iceberg in a sea of distraction, and we are trying to focus. And often I think that people who maybe are better at criticism than poetry or vice versa are seen by the culture at large, because we still care about language. It's almost a blank check term again. A person of letters. I'm just sort of floating that idea. But
we live at a time of constant distraction, of what certain critics call continuous partial attention, where you're checking your BlackBerry while you're checking your iPhone while it's ringing, and someone else expects you to pay attention to them while you do your job, which is this third thing. And that ought to affect poetry far less than it affects most of the other art forms that exist, because a poem wants your full attention, but a poem should be able to get it. And it won't necessarily take long, at least if it is a lyric or inscriptional or compressed poem, if it is short, as most poems by most considerable poets now tend to be. I don't know what I don't know what will happen to the novel.
Cell phone.
Yeah.
Well, those are being written.
I know.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. I want to open it in a few minutes to the audience, but before that, what does anybody on the panel want to add that you wanted to bring up, either about this question or anything else that's been raised?
I have been curious for a time if, Stephen and other critics have written about how the workshop environment is conducive to the broad-based production of poems that are easy to workshop, the workshoppable poem, and that may engender a kind of homogeneity. And I wonder if criticism, and specifically criticism for different venues, may encourage certain poetic styles as well too, that may be limiting to creative potential. I worry about, as I suggested in my introductory remarks, about writing for periodicals and that sort of time-pressured public statement, stacking the deck in favor of accessible poetry that makes fewer demands. I wonder if academic criticism, that it's subject to different pressures, not those same pressures, I wonder if it may be more conducive to, poetry that's really clear may not lend itself to scholarly criticism. I remember the title of the Larkin essay, "Wanted Good Hardy Critic." What is there to say about Hardy? It's right there in the poems. Just read them. So I wonder about what thoughts others have about that. Do certain venues reward specific types of writing at the expense of other equally important types of writing? So throw that out.
Shall we leave that one up to the audience as well as members of the... Oh, yes, Francis.
It strikes me that just introducing a name, that posits the notion that actually to say. But Ortega Gasset wrote The Dehumanization of Art and the Revolt of the Masses, and the two essays in the volume there. And it seems that the problem of what you just said made me think of that, because the problem of contemporary poetry is a little bit of the problem you've had with modernism in art, and that is to say that the poetry that is not clear or easily parsable, the kind you talk about, then brings us to the question of how do we evaluate new forms, a la Wallace Stevens, the problem that Wallace Stevens presented, and the kind of distillations that go on in abstract poetry, wordplay. How do you make critical evaluations of those, and particularly on the part of those editors like Paul Muldoon and so forth at the New Yorker, and that have to make decisions about poetry and create an aesthetic that. In a world, it strikes me as a comparable problem to the ones you have, where there's not an easily referential narrative nature to the poetry. It strikes me that, for instance, evaluating short stories is easier to do than evaluating certain types of modern poetry in general, and certainly novels.
Not for me. I don't think there is such a thing as abstract poetry, but I'm not even sure there's such a thing as abstract visual art, except for conceptual art, where there's actually not something you're supposed to see. When I look at Franz Klein, are any Franz Klein fans?
Here.
Yeah. When you look at a Franz Klein, you're thinking about geometry and action and the emotion of a person, which is who's implicit behind the brush, and you may also be thinking about what other paintings and what objects and scenes outside of painting that particular set of, usually it's big, broad, rough black and white
or Velázquez.
Yeah. You can be more or less specific. You can be making a kind of work where there are right answers to the question, what does that claim, what does that represent? But there are always possible answers.
Do you disagree with Ortega in a certain sense, or do you agree with him?
Which point of Ortega's are you?
Well, the dehumanization of art. The crux of the essay was based upon the notion that in order to, the artist has to perform a certain kind of hibernation, actually, to produce a language of his own that's not co-opted by the culture, and that the difficulty of modernism is part of the nature of what the endeavor of modernism is.
Yeah. I don't think. Modernism on the continent and here included people who wanted to set themselves against a public that wanted clearer art. And some poets at work today still want that. Some.
Shall we see if the audience wants to follow up any of this?
Here we have a question. Right
And
now.
if you can say your name also.
Yeah, we'd like to know your name.
My name is David Galiff. I know some of the panelists here. I ran an MFA program in creative writing for 6 years, and one of the ways I used to irritate the poets in the program was to point out, and I think this is true, that there's a lot of good poetry out there. Good criticism is actually a lot rarer. And one of the dichotomies I'd like to at least separate out a bit is that a good act of criticism is actually a good creative act, too. Often it's rare. But you mentioned Wallace Stevens. The Necessary Angel has some wonderful essays that are quite creative. And if you regard the Adagia as criticism, which it sort of is, it's there. So to some extent, they can both be viewed as creative acts, even though the two sides are often in turmoil. I don't know. That's not really a question, though you're welcome to respond to it.
Where did you teach, by the way?
I ran a program at the University of Mississippi. I publish in a variety of directions, Rachel can tell you.
He's a good poet, a good fiction writer, and a good critic. It shouldn't be allowed, but that's what he is.
Thank you very much.
I
I run the program at Montclair State now.
Nice.
So jump back over the Mason-Dixon line.
I wanted, before I forget, and thanking Bonnie for her very helpful sketch of Stevens's career and how it changed, there's a wonderful quote in Robert Frost's essay, The Figure a Poem Makes. I do not know what year he wrote that essay. Maybe Stephen or Bonnie can tell me, but he used it to preface all his collecteds. Right. And he has a terrific paragraph. I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately, but it goes something like this. Poets and scholars thrown together, he uses the word scholar, not critic, but are often annoyed by the puzzle of where they differ. And then he says, scholars tend to get their ideas sort of laid out ahead of them along pre-organized lines of logic, and poets haphazardly as it happens in and out of books. That's so beautifully put. I mean, that poets kind of learn somewhat serendipitously through promiscuous reading, which has been my experience. And then he says, sort of like somebody walking through a meadow, that what the poets read sticks to them like burrs sticking to your pants, more or less. Whereas the scholars are more focused, but they probably will exclude more, like a graduate student working on a well-directed dissertation, whose knowledge might be deeper but narrower. That's been, to me, a useful dichotomy, the way Frost poses it.
Who said that?
Frost.
We would like poems to reinvent the forms that they use, which requires a certain amount of eclecticism and at least the appearance of improvisation, even if there's also a set of constraints that are being followed. Whereas we do not expect the very form of the 2,000-word review essay or the shape of the monograph to be reinvented with each review essay or each monograph in order to feel that the critic has succeeded in doing what we want.
I tell this story a lot, but my son came home from daycare one day and announced that the boys and girls had divided themselves into two teams. The boys were all on Mysterious Team, and the girls were all on Plan Team. They had decided this collectively at recess, I guess, and And my wife and I, this became a very useful sort of trope around our house. Well, of course he's half our late. He's on Mysterious team, you know. And you start, once you are aware of this dualism, you start seeing it everywhere. It's Ernie and Burt, you know, or it's Falstaff and Prince Hal, or The Children of Apollo and the Children of Hermes in Under Which Lyre by W.H. Auden. It may be tempting to think that the poet and the critic are Mysterious team and Plan team, and, you know, respect perhaps, but friendship never. Falstaff the fool confronts forever the prig Prince Hal. But I think it's useful also to remember that in the eyes of the larger culture, we are all on this ever-shrinking ice floe together.
Yes,
we're all Mysterious Plan here, wrapped up together, and it's us against the world.
And of course, there's so many different types of criticism, some of which, to get back to David Gallups' point, are much closer to poetry than others. There's a meditative book on Shylock, for example, that came out recently, that really is half a poem. Yes.
I'm Karen Root, and I'm recovering from your announcement about the end of Philoctetes. I'm so sad. For readers of poetry, how would you recommend we use criticism? You know, I'm not someone who does either, but I'm interested as I'm a reader, and how that could.
Yay! This is good.
And how I can utilize criticism as well.
Good question.
Yeah.
But I'm going to let someone else answer it.
Well, my greatest moments as a critic are when I hear from readers of poetry that something I've written has helped them open up their experience. You know, and I think I've written on Marianne Moore, for instance, who's a poet who's opaque to many, who are even drawn to her, because I think all great poets throw some kind of hook out, no matter how difficult their poetry is. You know, there's something vivid in the language or the sound or the imagery that pulls you in, but you want to find a path through it. And you know, one very basic role for criticism is to help you find that path, so that you know that you can begin to see the patterns that organize it, or the questions that are driving it or motivating the poem. And I think that good critic is able to enables a reader in that way. I think there's another kind of critic, say, who's more theoretical, who gives you a sense of what kind of role literature can play in life, you know, and how literature organizes experience, and then you can be interested at that level, and what is the function of poetry, and criticism can help to illuminate that. Those are two questions I think that are, you know, that readers have, that can be answered or addressed at least by criticism. It's how I see it.
I'd suggest that you read the poem and read it aloud a couple of times before you look at the critic, so you can really get into a dialogue with the critic.
Yeah.
And also sometimes a critic will pick up one aspect but not talk, say, about sound effects or about something else that really excites you. So criticism can be very useful, but in conjunction with your own reading.
Or you can read criticism in order to discover new poems.
No, that's
Right.
true.
Right.
Heard of. And this is when I read criticism of arts other than poetry, art forms where I don't, you know, get 100 instances of the latest practice of that art form in the mail every week. The thing that I often want the most is for the critic to tell me why I might want to spend some of my free time the following weekend seeking out this new graphic novel by Laura Gulledge, or Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra. I had no idea that I might like Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra before I read Alex Ross explaining why I might like it. That's, for me, as a reader of criticism about other arts, that's even more valuable than somebody telling me something else about how to listen to the Rolling Stones, which I sort of think I, to some extent, know. I find that the criticism that's the most valuable to me as a reader of criticism is often criticism of the arts whose internal workings and whose history I know least.
Please go ahead.
Well, I'm speaking from another art as a painter, and I was interested. Wendy Gittler, and I was interested. You brought up the word form and forms, and I'm always interested in painting the old forms, how they can be reused. The forms are a vessel of thought for me in terms of painting, and I wondered in poetry whether you see changes in form that reveal certain things that are occurring now, or particular changes taking place in language or structure, because again, in the issues in terms of painting, there are many things happening. Some of them are continuum and some are discontinuum, and I just wondered in poetry what you see occurring in the landscape. Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about this, and a lot of hot air gets generated because the very definition of form is so problematic.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
I think there's the mysterious team and the plan team. I love that, Eric. I mean, the plan team would say maybe that forms like the sonnet are extremely durable, and we can, as it were, fill that vessel with new contents, but the vessel is constant. And other people say very different things. I would just say, as somebody who reads poems, judges them, and so forth, I will read a new book of poems someone has recommended, and they're all prose poems. Every single poem in the book looks like prose to me. So I sort of sit back and swallow my gum and try to absorb the implications of that. It's a ridiculously problematic issue in poetry. And people get very angry about it, and they've been getting angry about it for about 30 years, so it must be important.
No.
I think there's sometimes this assumption that poets who, as Rachel and I sometimes do, use some traditional devices, and maybe devices is even too reductive a term, but poets who use meter and rhyme are doing so in a kind of conservative, curatorial sort of way. We believe in the preservation of our institutions, and we must, blah, blah, blah. And I think just about any poet who's writing in good faith, if they're using meter and rhyme, are doing so because they heard a poem or read a poem by someone that was written metrically and thought, that's it, that's the thing I want to do. I want to make something that sounds like that. It's a much more honest, I think, artistic response than it's sometimes given credit for being. Another just point that I'd add to that is that people do object, I think justly, to the appropriation of the term formalist or formalism, like the misapplication of that exclusively to people writing in traditional meters and rhyme, as though form were not a concern at all of folks who weren't writing sonnets or writing iambic pentameter. Poetry is form. My friend Ben Lerner is very fond of saying, and I think that he's right about that, and that prosodic considerations don't just go out the window the minute you decide that you're not going to write a pentameter line. There may be insufficient critical discussion of what prosodic considerations went into the making of a poem that doesn't isn't in a received form, but I don't know. Maybe
because it's harder to do that discussion because we don't have received terms.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I'm something that I really ought to go and sit down and finish, but haven't been able to finish because it's taken a while, is a discussion of the kinds of prose poems that we have. Prose poems have forms and devices, and you can taxonomize them, and you can talk about how the ends of sentences work, and you can talk about how reference works.
And there's poems that move in and out of prose.
Yes,
Right.
like Ashbery's.
Yeah, for example.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of them.
Yeah.
And why did they go? Why did they move into lyric at that moment? And,
Yes. Yeah, but we don't have a ready-made, widely shared vocabulary. You have to invent terms that you can then hope to define clearly, and then hope other people will pick up on them. So it's harder to talk about those forms than it is to talk about the in memoriam stanza, where at least some people in this room already know that it's in tetrameter and it rhymes ABBA.
I think, Steve, we have an equally big problem in that some terms that do exist are so dangerous.
Like?
If I hear one more person talk about fixed form or traditional form, which are often used for types of writing that in fact aren't fixed at all, or experimental versus traditional poetry, I mean, those are so self-serving and so dangerous.
All poetry is experimental poetry.
Exactly.
I really like the point that our painter made about the bringing alive of old, of forms from the past, and it's easy to think about forms such as the villanelle or the sestina that are, medieval forms that are brought forward, but even things that look radically new and avant-garde are often reinventions of old forms. I mean, for instance, I remember once I was reviewing a book by the poet Jory Graham, and it occurred to me what she was doing was really like polyphony in music. It was using the multiple voices and the layering, that's rather different from classical music or Baroque music, an earlier form, and bringing it forward. And it looks very avant-garde, but it's actually just a reinvention of a different way of organizing pattern. And that's very exciting too. That's not to say that it's, that it's archaic in any way at all. I mean, it's very exciting to see those brought forward. It sounds as though that's what you do with your painting as well. Because it's always going to be new in a new context.
Just as to quote the wonderful young formalist poet A.E. Stallings, she and I were on a panel together on form at Princeton last weekend. And Derek Attridge gave a very interesting talk, by the way, about how the Norton Anthology's essay by John Stallworthy on meter asked students to impose this grid which did not work. It was a very interesting talk. Yeah. So Stallings has pointed out in print many times, as she says, it's often been pointed out that Lucretius, whom she's translated, writing around the time of Julius Caesar, or even a little earlier, has a beautiful passage which says, I am wandering along the untrodden paths of the muses where no footprint has ever been before. It's wonderful to drink clear water from the fountain. It's a little bit like Frost's poem, The Pasture. It's the same fountain. And yet Lucretius is writing after Epicurus, in the shadow of Epicurus, and even complaining it's hard to write in Latin what Epicurus wrote in Greek. So he's not without his predecessors. But the idea that inspiration is new is an extremely old idea. Okay?
How about one final? I'm sorry.
No, I'm just thinking of the poem of John Hollander's that ends, I shall make you but one promise safely hedged in the poet's paradox. I shall say, and then there are quote marks in the poem, what was never said before.
That's terrific. Let's have someone...
Wrote create, didn't he want a new form seem like the absence of form? That's
Okay. Let's have one more question and then...
I'm so happy to present what is a final poem, I suppose. I remember seeing an Andy Warhol painting, and it said Tisk. It was a cartoon, and it showed a teardrop. And I thought, oh dear, is that what modern art is going to say as far as, what happened to civilization? Tisk, tisk, So that's how I feel right now at the news. Tisk, tear. Cookout. They were burning us at the stake. Poets, critics, readers, all. The words were too wooden, some claimed. Others added the same husks to the funeral pyre.
That's a very good note on which to end the audience participation. But before we do that, each poet, so we will go up in flames, agreed that here he would read a couple of poems. And let's do that first, and then we can end the session, and let's move in alphabetical order, which means that we start with Steve.
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just a couple of poems, and then...
2 poems?
2 poems. It's two
okay.
or 3, I think we can. If they're short, we have time for. So.
Let's do 2.
Okay.
There's a wonderful, long, ambitious poem by Wallace Stevens called Sunday Morning that some of you know. This is a short, unambitious poem called Sunday Afternoon. When all the kids, babies, and grown-ups are napping at nap time and sleep well during the day, it is a masterpiece. There are trombones and harps in order, banjos, hosannas in heaven, and orchestras tune up and start to play an instrumental hymn of Jubilee very quietly so as not to wake the babies. Butterfly with parachute. A real one wouldn't need one, but the one Nathan draws surely does. 4 oblongs, the size and color of popsicles, green apple, toasted coconut, and grape, flanked, 2 per side, by billowing Valentine hearts in a frame of Scotch tape. Alive, it might stay off the floor for a few unaerodynamic minutes. Thrown as a paper airplane for 1 or 2 more. Very sensibly, therefore, our sun gave it something not to keep it apart from the ground forever, but rather to make safe its descent. When we ask that imagination discover the limits of the real world only slowly, maybe this is what we meant.
Thank you very much. I will read a couple. Actually, none of these are in form, though I often write haikus and sonnets. The first one, frankly, was inspired by my mother's death. Waking hours. Last night I dreamed the undertakers had left you, smaller and perfectly preserved, wrapped and rolled in a closet among the furled umbrellas and the electric broom wonder you'd planned to repair before that first operation on the inoperable. You were as light to lift as hope, and I laid you on the bed, making sure your tiny head was safely on the pillow you plumped each morning as you grew thinner. Let me care for you again. Unfurl your smile again, Mother, and protect my head from the cloudbursts of flashback. Then let me bury you again. I think we need a more cheerful one after that. This one is called Garden Party, and if there are any gardeners, have any of you seen that amazing cactus known as Schwarzkopf aeonium? It's one weird flower. I mean, it really is black. Garden Party. Schwarzkopf aeonium, a daisy with attitude, as determined as a couplet, and it would know from off rhyme. These plants never get lost, even on foggy nights. Like other bullies, it wears its improbable Halloween costume all year long. No one can believe this flower was ever a virgin. These bad girls scare to death the debutantes coming out at the Chelsea Flower Show. These bad girls scare off even gravel-voiced, chain-smoking cactuses in singles bars. A flower that plays the tenor sax in jazz combos. Petals darker and more insistent than a Rhone wine. Stalks even a New York cop would rather not mess with. Rachel.
One poem, and it's the poem that gives my last book of poems, The Ache of Appetite. It's titled because it ends with that phrase. The poem confusingly has a different title. And I think it tries to perform a little act of literary criticism in that it asks us to think, how do we think of poems? Again, if you're judging a contest or trying to decide what to review, what is the Platonic model of a poem in your head? And I just suggest there's no one model. Home Remedy. A poem need not be a diary entry or letter, dream report, or a shred of the observations of a day, nor a thumbnail answer to what someone said. It needn't be a massive rusted arc of sculpture. It can be one polished stone, luminous as a cat's eye in the dark, compact as a tiny ivory pawn. Axe to the frozen sea, said Kafka, or a formulation of Northrop Frye's, myth cross-sectioned yields up metaphor. If life's a loaf, a poem is a slice, not a cooked dish, let alone a full meal, not even one ripe, glowing piece of fruit. More like a scribbled recipe to tell future strangers the approximate ingredients that, hungry in your time, you put together. Cook, eat, read, and write. Think of a poem, finally, as the home remedy for the ache of appetite.
If you'll indulge me, I'll just say a few poems from this children's book that I've got coming out. It's most of the poems really were written by my kids. I just sort of versified them. Evan, my son, is about 7 years old in the book, and Sage, my daughter, is about 2. I think there ought to be a guy, said Evan, with one X-ray eye and extra fingers, who can swallow top-secret files because he's hollow, except that he contains a motor that turns a helicopter rotor that's where his shoulder blade should be, and who speaks dolphin, and who's me. Here's one about Sage. Rats, said Sage, whose magic marker refused to color any darker. Uh-oh, I think I hear them coming, I said. Be careful what you summon. Rats are responsive. If you call too loudly, you might get them all. Are you prepared to deal with that? She scratched her head. I guess not. Rat. And then I don't have this one here, but I'll conclude with one that involves both of them. In the woodcut illustration, Evan is holding a little caterpillar that's got kind of an oddly human face, and Sage is looking at it. Are caterpillars always slow? Sage asked her brother. Yes and no, depending on your point of view, he told her. What looks slow to you may look more like a lightning bolt shot from a caterpillar pult to something that can barely budge, like grass or moss or cold hot fudge. And let's be honest, we don't know how fast this little guy can go when motivated. Maybe he'd turn on his secret hyperspeed if he were really scared or late or traveling on the interstate. Maybe he takes it slow and steady because he's always there already. Thanks very much. He was my model. That was the disappearing alphabet. So, that's a good question. Yeah, they ought to share a byline, but
Thank you very much.
I'm sure. Hold on. One or two final announcements. One, I'm sure all the poets here would be happy, and critics, happy to stay around for a few minutes and talk with you more. There are books for sale, as you heard. But above all, I'd like to lift a glass and thank the organizers of Philoctetes and hope it will show reincarnation is possible. Yeah.